You probably think you know what makes a marriage work. Love, communication, shared values, maybe a little bit of luck. That's the general consensus, right? The advice your parents gave you, the stuff therapists put on posters, the framework basically every romantic comedy ever made is built around. And sure, those things matter. But here's what nobody tells you at the wedding. The statistical predictors of divorce have almost nothing to do with how much you love each other. The data on what actually ends marriages is so counterintuitive, so completely at odds with what we've been told, that most people spend years inside a high-risk marriage without having any idea. Researchers have been studying divorce patterns for decades, across countries, income levels, cultures, and generations. And what keeps coming up isn't what you'd expect. It's not affairs. It's not fighting. It's not even falling out of love. The strongest predictors of divorce are things that were already true about you and your partner before you ever said a word to each other. And that's what makes this uncomfortable. Because by the time most people find out, it's already too late to change them. Let's start with the one that surprises people the most. How old you were when you got married is one of the single strongest predictors of whether that marriage survives. And the relationship isn't linear. It doesn't just get better the older you are, it peaks. And then it drops again. People who marry in their teens have dramatically higher divorce rates than people who wait until their mid to late 20s. That part, most people intuitively understand. You're young, you're still figuring out who you are, you grow in different directions. But here's the part nobody talks about. People who marry after their mid-30s also show higher divorce rates than people who married in their late 20s. Researchers at the University of Utah found that the lowest divorce risk sits around age 28 to 32. Why? Because people who marry later often have more deeply entrenched habits, stronger individual identities, higher standards built from years of independent living, and less flexibility to adapt to another person's life. The same maturity that makes you a better partner in theory makes you harder to actually live with in practice. The sweet spot is narrow, and most people are on the wrong side of it. The data is very consistent. Your relationship history before marriage is not irrelevant. It follows you in. Studies consistently show that people who cohabited with multiple partners before marriage have higher divorce rates than people who didn't. Not because living together is bad practice, but because serial cohabitation is associated with what researchers call relationship churning, a pattern of cycling through commitment without fully processing what went wrong. Then there's the premarital pregnancy factor. Couples who marry because of an unplanned pregnancy divorce at significantly higher rates than couples who married without that pressure. The child isn't the problem. The compressed decision-making is. And then there's the one that makes people genuinely uncomfortable. Your parents' marriage. If your parents divorced, your own divorce risk is statistically elevated. Studies estimate somewhere between a 50 and 70% higher likelihood, depending on the methodology. And if both you and your partner come from divorced households, that risk multiplies. This isn't about destiny, it's about modeling. The relationship behaviors you watched growing up are the ones your nervous system defaults to under stress. Conflict resolution, emotional expression, how you handle distance, how you handle closeness, all of it gets learned before you're old enough to question it. You don't just marry a person, you marry everything they watched at home growing up. If you want to know whether a marriage is going to survive, look at the bank account. Financial stress is the single most cited cause of marital conflict across virtually every study that's ever looked at this question, but it's more specific than just money problems cause divorce. The data tells a more precise and more uncomfortable story. Couples where one or both partners carry significant debt into the marriage divorce at higher rates. Not because debt is shameful, but because financial stress produces a specific kind of chronic low-grade conflict that erodes intimacy over time. It changes how you make decisions together. It changes how you talk about the future. It creates resentment that has nothing to do with love and everything to do with pressure. Then there's income disparity. Couples with large income gaps between partners show elevated divorce rates in multiple studies. The dynamic this creates around autonomy, dependency, decision-making power, and self-worth puts structural pressure on the relationship that affection alone can't consistently absorb. And here's the one that cuts against a common assumption. Unemployment in men specifically is one of the strongest financial predictors of divorce in the data, more so than female unemployment, more so than general financial hardship. Researchers believe this is connected to identity, social expectation, and the psychological weight men carry around their provider role, regardless of what their partner actually expects from them. The marriage didn't fail because they stopped loving each other. It failed because the infrastructure collapsed and took everything else with it. This is where it gets really interesting. Psychologists have been trying to identify personality-based predictors of divorce for decades, and what they've landed on is surprisingly specific. Neuroticism, which is the clinical term for emotional instability, anxiety proneness, and negative emotional reactivity, is one of the strongest personality predictors of divorce in the research. Not because neurotic people are bad partners, but because high neuroticism in either partner creates a relationship environment where conflict is more frequent, more intense, and harder to recover from. The problem is that neuroticism is one of the most stable personality traits across a lifetime. It's not something that significantly improves just because you decide to work on it. Then there's what psychologist John Gottman identified after decades of observing couples in his lab. He found 4 specific communication patterns so predictive of divorce that he called them the 4 horsemen: contempt, criticism, defensiveness, and stonewalling. And of those 4, contempt, the sense that you are fundamentally better than your partner, was by far the most lethal. Couples who showed contempt for each other during conflict discussions divorced at dramatically higher rates than couples who fought without it. You can scream at each other. You can disagree about everything. But the moment one partner starts looking down on the other, the data says the clock has started. So, what do you do with all of this? If you're single, the instinct is to turn this into a checklist. Find someone who ticks every box. Avoid the risk factors. Optimize your way into a stable marriage. That's not quite what the data is saying. What it's actually saying is that the factors most predictive of divorce are not character flaws. They're circumstances, histories, and deeply embedded patterns that neither person fully chose. You didn't choose your parents' marriage. You didn't choose the financial environment you grew up in. You didn't choose your baseline neuroticism score. What you can do is know about them, and knowing changes things, not because awareness magically rewires behavior, but because the couples who understand their own risk factors and actually engage with them through therapy, through honest conversation, through deliberate pattern interruption, show meaningfully better outcomes than couples who drift through on the assumption that love is enough. Love is not enough. The data is very clear about that. Love is the reason you try. The work is what makes it last. Subscribe, and I'll see you on the next one.